extraction shooters, Tarkov lights, or likes. Why haven't we seen this genre grow in popularity despite having great success and a lengthy tenure? Well, I'm sure volume has something to do with that, with it not being a genre that's had many attempts compared to other ones like shooters or even MOBAs. But the deeper reason is a harder one to parse, and is not one so readily available to you as a fan of the genre. And it ultimately, of course, depends on the kind of attempt at an extraction shooter, of which, of course, there's been a couple. But just a few years ago, one was attempted in the dieselpunk world, an interesting, less utilized art style, especially in a multiplayer context. Marauders, developed by Small Impact Games, was a first-person multiplayer extraction looter shooter where players acted as space pirates or marauders. You can form a squad or go alone and attempt to survive a dangerous map filled with locations you can explore for loot, new gear, or things you can use to upgrade your ship with. But things aren't so peachy keen, of course. These maps are filled with other players as well, outside of your squad, and they are looking to do the same thing you are. Problem is, you both have what each other want, and are each other's obstacles usually. But the winner takes all in Marauders, and the loser loses all of their loot. That's the cause of that rush of emotion that floods you as you play an extraction shooter, hoping to make it out with the new loot, or at least just keep the loot that you came with. But Marauders might have been one of the more fun extraction shooters we have seen, but after just a couple years after its early access launch in October of 2022, it's been abandoned completely, with no new updates for over a year. Well, that's our cue, detectives. It's time to step in and talk about Marauders on the Death of a Game show, because it sadly has been left to rot. Death of a Game, of course, is a series that investigates the largest contributing factors for the death of a game or company, whether in the process of dying or literally dead. To do this, we investigate a timeline of events, filled with clues, developer testimonies, and crucial player feedback leading ultimately to a final deduction, a moment where we wrap the case up for good and solve the mystery or mysteries. I'm Minas, your lead detective, usually, but for this episode I'm donning a mask, a weapon, and taking the role of a marauder. Get to the ship. We have some space to plunder, detectives. The story begins with the minting of a new Twitter page, originally teased as simply "exciting news coming soon" from Small Impact Games, a video game studio created by Mitchell Small, James Robotham, and Cameron Small in 2013, hence Small being in the name. Founded in the UK in 2013, Small Impact Games, or simply SIG, was a video game developer created by previous Electronic Arts and Rocksteady studio developers. Small Impact Games would find work as a contract developer first, assisting other developers on their projects before teaming up with Team 17 to provide developer and publisher support for their upcoming game, Marauders. That was before shopping multiple demo and project ideas before settling on Marauders. One of those game ideas was even one that got showcased at conventions and on video game media sites, The Black Death, which never actually came to be. Perhaps a clue or sign of things to come. First announced to the world fully March 22nd, 2022, Marauders, a space pirate looter shooter for up to 4 players in a squad, was set to be released in early access later that same year. Marauders is a highly replayable dieselpunk-themed space pirate FPS set in the early 1990s alternate future. You'll make raids and try to survive and upgrade your gear through XP along the way. Gear that persists with you from match to match. Marauders' art style was cool, and with a combination of space and ground combat, Marauders was setting up to be Space Tarkov. That's Escape from Tarkov, by the way, of course, being the most popular de facto extraction shooter, probably the one behind spawning the entire genre. Or multiplayer looter shooters, whatever you'd like to call them. This would be more, though, as it's being advertised, than just another Tarkov. Marauders would be playable shortly after, which was a good look, I think. But with the game set to launch later in that year, in early access, Small Impact Games better have a good first showing, lest people not be willing to give them another chance. This idea that early access multiplayer games can just simply hobble onto a launch and people are going to keep caring and playing the game has just not really been proven. Early impressions of the alpha test of May of 2022 from IGN were rather positive. The Marauders alpha has been a great proof of concept for moving the subgenre of multiplayer survival shooters that DayZ started into new and interesting territory. My limited time with the current build was frantic, tense, and a ton of fun. I'll keep a close eye on how the vision of this multiplayer space piracy develops in the future. Now, to be clear, it's more of an extraction shooter than a DayZ-like game. DayZ is a survival game, and Marauders didn't have a persistent world, so I'm not really sure why they made that comparison. But anyway, Marauders was interesting, because it wasn't just a standard ground raid or loot session. Instead, it was actually divided into 3 different parts. Part 1 had you gearing up and hopping into your ship solo, or with your crew, and then traveling to the raid location, which would differ depending on which point of interest you're looting, of course. But be careful, because on the way to that site, you can be engaged by the enemy squad ships, and even destroyed. Part 2 is landing at the site, where you can then explore and loot. But beware, there are AI Marauders and also players around, and they're interested, usually, in killing you. Part 3 is the escape part. You must grab your loot and team and make it to your ship in time, and then take that ship to an escape gate on the perimeter of the map to actually escape. If you're unable to take your ship, you can then hop into an escape pod at the expense of your ship instead, making for some even more tense situations. Once you escape, you're able to divide up the new loot that you acquired, re-up on supplies, craft new items, or even upgrade your arsenal. All of this, of course, preparing for the next raid. The concept was cool, and I think IGN was right to give them a positive reception and say that they had a good proof of concept in alpha. Problem was that the beta was only set to be just a few months later, which would make that positive remark not that positive, because just a few months after having a proof of concept isn't usually enough time to build a well-rounded and polished online game. Perhaps the funding wasn't enough for SIG from Team 17, or deadlines with performance expectations were just put into place, but I just don't know why the timeline was so ultimately rushed. Marauders beta would happen over the course of the summer of 2022, and would be just for under a week. While limited testing is good, especially depending on your goals, limited testing with early access games for me usually felt more like a design thing than a bug, in the sense that they were totally fine knowing you would only have the time to enjoy just a vertical slice of the game before buying it to have to experience more, but without the idea that it was going to go on longer than that since you didn't know for sure. Sorry, I just don't find early access to be the most honest approach at financing a video game project, especially when a project already has a publisher supposedly supporting them. But because we're so used to the biggest, even if they are the worst, to dictate what becomes commonplace, well, naturally people will just let me know in the comments below that, well, Tarkov is still in early access and is launching soon, which is true. But these aren't one-to-one games, and the competition is only increased and has increased from then. Not to mention, Tarkov wasn't started from scratch. The dev team actually worked on a game that was set in the same universe previously that was also a shooter on browser. Marauders would have their playtest and technical test sessions in September of 2022. This test would be the first chance to play the game without paying, and for me personally, had little purpose past a point. Sure, you could get some feedback from this and all, and if you're set to launch in weeks, though, what are you testing exactly? Stress testing servers? Maybe. And if this was a proper early access title, perhaps they could just keep improving the game. But the problem with early access without already having a player base or community, and just probably in general, is that if you take too long to build up the unfinished game that you launched with, people don't want to be patient, especially for multiplayer shooters. There has to be enough there for them to enjoy. Marauders Early Access would drop October 3rd, 2022, and here the world for the first real time got to experience what Space Tarkov was all about. Marauders wasn't covered by many critics, and wasn't properly reviewed really by them either. But the players who played and reviewed the game on Steam would give it a positive score of 79% initially, stating it very much was a Space Tarkov experience simplified, and not nearly as hardcore. It was also easier to flee the large maps of 24 players, even as a solo player. But many titles featured in this series have early success. But as many detectives know watching this now, multiplayer titles take more than just a few months of good population to find success. They need enough consistency to build their audience. 14K peak players on Steam wasn't a bad start though. But the population would already take a big hit, besides the, natural drop of population that most titles are going to suffer from after their launch. And many attribute this to the health update that would drop November 10th, 2022. This update would make healing more difficult by increasing the healing time and reducing effectiveness of healing in general. This would make it also harder for solo players to compete overall, alongside making breaching ships a key part of the game more damaging to players, and thus more risky. While these might have been positive changes in a sense, sometimes even if you want to make positive changes, you have to also account for other side effects that you end up kind of making more negative. While Marauders was a Tarkov-like, it was different besides the space parts in the sense that it was more casual, including how easy it was to play as a solo looking for short loot runs, compared to other extraction shooters, whether that be ammo type simplified, armor simplified, and so on and so forth. Maybe accidentally at least, small impact games had lost some of what made their game unique. This was reflected in the population, at only 4K players peak now, and under 2K concurrently. The Red Baron update would drop December 14th, 2022 and would introduce a new boss, the Red Baron. Besides this addition and some other contract changes, this update would introduce a larger player count, now up to 40 players from about 24. But don't worry, they would actually double the raid spawns now and create a larger map to house it all. But I have to admit, I don't get why they increased the player size. Tarkov only had like 12 to 16 players on the max largest map, and many other shooters like this wouldn't even have as many as 40 players on the same map either. Marauders seemed to have some cool ideas, but had their head in the wrong place, looking to add things to their game that didn't really make their game better, and arguably was making it worse, especially when the last major thing to accompany this update was a wipe. Yep, Small Impact Games apparently was warning of these wipes ahead of time in early access, but once a game costs money, it's a full product, regardless of whatever state it's in, meaning that people will expect a live game not to wipe. Not until the game at least like fully launches again or something, early access or not, even if I disagree with that personally. The United Allies update would drop April 25th, 2023, and would introduce several new items to the game, including new weapons, a new location, the Colony Cruiser, and for some reason not already included in the game originally, proximity chat. This update would also heavily increase the ship count of the game. But this would outline a larger problem at hand with the ship combat in general in the game. It was lackluster as hell. I'm not gonna mince words. I played on Starsider and Star Wars Galaxies, the de facto space server for the game, and the space system in that game, which is like 20 years old at this point, was far, far better than what was in Marauders. I now explain why. For starters, although Marauders has a cool concept of space combat mixed with the ground combat, the space combat feels more like boat combat, which is a common problem in space games, than plane or even spaceship combat. This stays the same no matter what level or scale of ship you have, or even in-game ships seemingly engage in a strange game of yaw wars, I call it, circling each other without any actual maneuvering or space combat concepts. Worse, the early ships, including the Rust Bucket as it's called, the one that you start with, feel less like ships and more like pods that carry really other pods or something, which is strange in itself. They are unyielding in movement, look like slightly different variants of each other, and have very weak weapons that make combat with other Marauders early on more of a nuisance than a challenge or worthwhile endeavor. Fights become more about racing to the given point of interest to loot before your opponents do, because once you are docked, you're basically invincible save being wiped, and getting your keycard taken. Marauders didn't seem to know what they wanted to do with the space portions of their game, and if their idea was to further expand things there, they had to make the actual systems and combat more enjoyable, and better than games that were like decades older. Not something that you can easily do after live development, as you also have to keep making new content to satisfy your player base who's already bought in. It's a shame, because Marauders had some really cool ideas, like breach pods and ship combat in a Tarkov-like sense. But these ideas that started as positives almost became negatives over time, due to their effect on the game's design and gameplay. The population would jump back up after the update, which made sense given it added quite a bit of content. But sadly, Marauders seemed to find itself in this situation where, although it was a good enough game, like in a sense, including with progressive updates that kept coming out to keep the old players returning, they would return by lower and lower numbers over time. For example, the Excavation update, which added some new weapons, a new breachable ship in the mining frigate, and another boss, the Warden, was an update that, although quite positive overall, would only bring the population back up to around 4,500 players peak, with like 600 players concurrent. As the player base would shrink and shrink, it would create a compounding issue that I cover a lot in the series, where now the players that are left were the most hardcore Marauders, capable of solo wiping your squad. Another problem would also rear its ugly head more and more as the population would continue to dwindle, and that's people leaving the map instances when they don't get the POIs that they want to loot. This would then create a situation that makes the game feel even more dead and forces other players into instances that they might not even want to be in. Throw in the fact that solos were nerfed by taking damage when breaching, which was half of your HP gone, by the way, and now Marauders was only being played by real-life Marauders. GG. And I can't believe I'm saying this because I think it's always just such a lazy type of analysis or excuse to be like, well, if this game just had more of X, it would have been better. But seeing all the comments saying, what if Marauders had more like focus on PvE? I'm not gonna lie, but I kind of agree. Even just creating a space station for everyone to run around in between the missions would have been a good idea. Just more things to add more to it than kind of just feeling like a mod to a lobby game. The Plunder update would add the Bandit, an NPC who basically would play like a loot goblin, as well as the new mode, the Raider mode, which sounded like a BR match between up to 6 players, for some reason. Not that BRs can't work in survival games, I mean, I used to play tons of them in Rust, or extraction shooters, but why with only 6 players? And why not add a mode that lets players connect such a mode to the standard forms of gameplay already nearly abandoned? The Plunder update also reportedly was supposed to be part of the previous update, the Excavation update, but likely due to how fast these updates were coming out, which was impressive for a small company, but would it be enough if they already flubbed so much at launch and were seemingly only just filling in the holes for their game that was just unfinished? The Guilds update would drop December 14th, 2023 and introduce, well, guilds to the game, including a guild hideout. More weapons were also added to the game, including a rework to experience and another wipe. The population wasn't recovering from these updates anymore though, especially when the last update took longer to come, at around 3 to 4 months. Marauders was already being forgotten by the main culture gaming zeitgeist, but now even by its own dedicated gamers, as it would fall to just over 1,000 players peak. This same year, and Bungie would announce an extraction shooter of their own, one that would later go on to get such a bad reception, they would have to put it back in the oven. The Retribution update, unbeknownst to most, would be the game's last update, released August 16th, 2024, and would introduce 2 new maps, the Fortress and the Rebel Base, including 2 new bosses with them as well. The update helped, but it was trying to resurrect a max population of 227 players, which it did, to nearly like 800 now, but within a month, and the population had already dropped back down to half of that. We fast forward over a year and Marauders hasn't received an update since, as of November 2025. While I've heard rumblings that the devs want to port the game to Unreal Engine 5, since it's actually developed using the 4th engine, I think it's likely, regardless if that's true or not, that Marauders as we know it won't be sticking around. Not with like 30 players peak and 13 on average. There's just not much that you can salvage with that, and worse, Arc Raiders just released and is already doing big numbers. It's essentially another sci-fi themed extraction shooter, difference being they didn't bother with the space stuff, and the AI and thus the NPCs are much more challenging. This game, which is also described like a more casual version of Tarkov, is being received quite well, due to its combination of its good polish and challenging but rewarding gameplay. So Marauders had its moment, and that moment was years ago, when the game was first playable, but it didn't take long for them to lose whatever leads they had, and now with titles like Arc Raiders out and doing well, it's not going to be likely that Marauders can even compete and be competitive ever again. Let alone just continue to exist for much longer, especially with reports that the developer's team have been downsized already. Now, I hear some in the community saying that, well, it was Team 17 that was holding back small impact games, but I'm gonna have to be devil's advocate. If SIG wasn't bringing in the paper, or the revenue, or the cheese, whatever you'd like to call it, or Team 17 didn't see a path forward for them, that's just business. It sucks, but that's just how it goes. The unprofessional part is just not admitting this and stringing your audience around and along for whatever's left. The music's playing, detectives, and yeah, I know this is a short case, but it's nice to get those from time to time. Anyway, Marauders might have been a cool and unique attempt at a Tarkov-like, but instead it's been left scrapped, sort of like an abandoned ship or a fallen marauder. In case you missed any of the clues along the way as to why Marauders has been abandoned or is dying, why is Marauders on the Death of a Game show? Over time, it just started to have much tougher competition. It had fundamental early changes that killed uniqueness. Early access woes, low population. The uniqueness of the game became a problem over time. It was abandoned by its developers. Being too much like Tarkov ultimately hurt them in the end. Extraction shooters might not be numerous due to their difficulties in finding success when compared to more broadly acceptable designs like a MOBA or a shooter. But they're not going anywhere, especially with the recent success of Arc Raiders and the fact that Bungie is still working on their marathon game. But Marauders, especially as we knew it, is basically done, because you can't even find enough players to fill a single map anymore. I wish small impact games luck in the future, as I normally do in these situations when I see talent, but it's going to be hard for them to convince someone to buy in when this was how they handled their business and their community, left in the dust. There's always going to be that what if. What if Marauders didn't, get stuck in the shadow of Tarkov? And what if it tried to be something more than whatever it was? We'll never know what that game's like. There's a bit of a glimpse of what that could have looked like if you go check out Wildgate on Steam, which is actually a crew-based PvP multiplayer shooter that also blends tactical ship-to-ship combat with fast-paced first-person action as well. It also had a good early reception too. So personally, I hope to see many more titles like this, because I just think that this kind of game is interesting. Thanks for watching, And let me know in the comments below if you played Marauders and what you think I missed concerning why it failed. Also, if you didn't play Marauders, give me your whole thoughts on the extraction shooter genre as a whole, including your thoughts on the more recent Orc Raiders if you've got the chance to play it. Until the next case.
の渦によって現実世界は破壊と混乱に飲み込まれた。この借りは必ず返す。